Biomechanics and stability. So that's the topic of today's session. Uh, When I put it up in the course description, it was about coordination and balance, and I'm going to approach it more from the perspective of stability. We'll deal with those words later in the session. So let's briefly review what we've been learning. In the first two sessions, we talked about how passive elements in our body, which is elastic tissues, uh, store and retrieve elastic energy, and this helps us create efficient movements. So it's the concept of the energy cycle. But then we introduce the concept of deliberation uh, by talking about how muscles interact with the energy cycle to modulate, if you will, the amount of elastic energy we store in our body at any time, which amounts to the capacity of doing specific movements. Today, we're going to talk about what impedes this cycle and some ways we can try to better understand to make more informed choices in our wellness and workouts. So here is a question we pondered over in the first session. After you watched Floyd Mayweather jumping rope, I asked what words would you use to describe movements that you appreciate? And these are the answers you gave me. The movement, the aspects of this that I would like to capture today are smooth, fluid, things that flow. And we're going to talk about it from the perspective of the opposite, meaning what impedes smoothness and fluidity. Here is another word association game. So what words would you associate with obstruction to flow or smooth movement? We have our first, oh, we have already 3 responses. Excellent. You can submit more than one if you think of more than one. Let's see what you're saying. Okay. We're going to talk about tremors today and unstable movements, choppy movements. Good. Excellent. I agree with these things. So let's talk a little bit of what we can observe. So far, we have explored a word that connects jumping, yoga, and Tai Chi, which is flow. Intuitively, flow can be interrupted by restrictions or blockage. For example, when we imagine a river being blocked, and the energy in this case being water flowing. So what are examples of restrictions in the body, and how can we observe the effect of these restrictions? So what impedes the flow of elastic energy in our body? All right. Let's see what you're saying. Stiffness, tight muscles, other muscles, scar tissue, yes. Tension, yes. Hypermobility, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if that's true or not. Spasticity. I see. Lack of stretching in the right direction. So keep these in mind. Keep your answers in mind, and let's see how you feel at the end of the session. So let's try to pin down stabilization a little bit. So complex movements require stabilization across all joints, and we have over 350 of them. And let's use the elbow joint as an example to understand stabilization. Muscles, tendons, and ligaments stabilize joints during movement. These elements, like we have been discussing throughout the course, have elastic properties similar to springs. Unlike springs, they cannot push out when compressed, but like springs, they can exert a pull force when stretched. We use the mental model of a resistance band, and if it's too compressed, it can't really push out, but if it's held taut, it can pull back in, depending on how much tension it's under. Muscles can reduce in length, unlike this elastic band, in response to a neural input. And muscles can exert passive forces without help from the central nervous system across a joint when stretched. Muscles can stabilize joints by holding them in place. Just imagine trying to hold your fist in place when somebody is trying to knock it off. You can use muscles to really keep it in place. So muscles can also passively stabilize joints without using any neural inputs by acting as a hammock, a sling, whatever word you prefer, something elastic like a rubber band. So to get an intuition for these different types of stabilization, let's do a simple exercise. Stability just means some not having an unpredictable response to an external force. We want to, if there is an external force perturbing us, we want to be able to use it and ideally store as elastic energy. So now hold out your arm in front of you and do what I did earlier. Contract your arm muscles really hard so that your hand will stay there even if someone tries to whack it away. Now, when you just held it out there, you mostly used passive stabilization, hopefully. But when you deliberately engaged active stabilization, if you did it hard enough, you perhaps experienced it as your muscles, your arm shaking. So when is active stabilization advantageous? Active in this case just means we are activating the muscles from the nervous system. Passive just means the stabilization is being provided passively without input from the nervous system. Okay, what are you saying? When moving, let's talk about that. High impact activities, we're going to see an example of that. You already saw it. I'm going to recap from a different perspective. When bracing for impact, again, we saw this in the case of jumping rope, and we'll talk about this in this context. All these are moving it's an interesting perspective because I just said if you engage too much active stabilization, if you whack your arm, you're not going to move. Right now, basically, we froze certain joints. So in my how I think about it is active stabilization is a trade-off between mobility and being able to deal with external forces. So let me ask you the same question slightly different, in a slightly different manner. When do we actually make use of it? Rather than when is active stabilization helpful? So maybe first I'll tell when I think it's really helpful. When let's say I'm falling on my face, then if the muscles kick in and make sure that the joints don't go too far so that the ligaments don't tear, then it's useful. Uh, when I think of it as emergency services. So when do we actually make use of active stabilization? So the answers, most of the answers were in the previous question. It's actually when we end up engaging active stabilization, yes, when lifting weights, when resisting impact, when we need to protect ourselves. Perfect. When we're falling, yes. If you're in the edge, if you're on a ski slope and you get close to the edge, you probably tend to hold on from fear. When resisting a contrary force, yes. All that is true. Most of us also unconsciously engage active stabilization when it is not necessary, and I'll show you examples of this today. If you recall your yoga instructor saying, if you shake, you have gone too far, this is exactly what she's talking about. We want to create poses without having to shake or without having to engage active stabilization. The point is to explore the limits of what our body can do without having to engage emergency services. So the shaking during active stabilization is often too subtle to notice, but it can be measured using accelerometers. It's very obvious when you held your arm out and contracted as hard as you possibly could and your arm started shaking. That's when it's obvious, but it happens all too often. So an accelerometer is just a device that measures how quickly velocity is changing, speed of an object is changing, and it can measure in all three directions. And these accelerometers these days, you can find them in your phone. So you can download an app and just start exploring and playing with it. So to detect the shaking, uh, we measure acceleration in the up-down direction. So the task is the person holds the phone in the hand and they just reach forward. That's all they do. Something not high intensity, not high impact, just hand the phone to somebody else. What you see in most people is that there is this signature up-down movement. It's not visible to the naked eye in the sense that when I shake here, when I hold my arm and shake, it doesn't, unless it's really bad, you won't really see it, even though you feel it. But you can pick it up using accelerometers. So here's a typical signature of this wobble or shaking. The question is, does it have to happen in order to create a movement, or can movements happen without us having to do this? You just have to find a counterexample. And when I asked trained dancers to do the same thing, I admit I only have asked a couple of people. It is possible to do the same task, which looks very similar, but feels very different, without having to engage this wobbling or shaking. I'll show you a few more examples. So first, video, give me a thumbs down in case you don't hear the audio from this. I'm recording. There are little devices on my arms. These are wireless devices, accelerometers, which detect shaking where I put them. They can also detect other things. If I move my arm, they detect that because the speed of my arm is changing. And I'm going to do a couple of Tai Chi movements. What I want you to observe is this top bar here. It corresponds to my left arm. I had an accident and I have some restriction in my neck, which probably translates to me having to engage active stabilization in my left arm more than anywhere else. So as I play the video, pay attention to the traces on the top of the screen. That little wobble is what I'm talking about. It's very small. I have a little bit of practice trying to reduce the amount of wobble, but it's still there. It can get better. You clearly didn't observe my arm shaking. Sorry, okay. So this is the position that my arm was in when it started, when my forearm started wobbling. And if I extract the data and plot it in higher resolution, this is what it'll look like. Now, perhaps this is an unstable position for my arm, and I somehow end up having to hold on to dear life when I go there. So luckily, as I was setting up for this video and I was documenting the position of my sensors, I ended up putting my arm in that position. Here's an example. And see what happens when my arm goes into that twist. You see that up there? It doesn't happen on my other arm, just my left side. So my arm ended up, I'm in a different pose overall, but my shoulder joint and arm ended up in the same position, and and I engaged active stabilization unconsciously. So for the same configuration, even in different poses, it's possible to engage something. So these are things we can become aware of slowly through meditation or whatever it is, and learn to help elastic energy flow through in the body. Here is a different pose. It doesn't mean that I only engage active stabilization in that pose. We're now looking at the forearm, right? The shaking happens throughout my arm.
Turn to tabletop.
That's what I'm talking about right there.
Take a deep breath in. Turn to table.
So in this case, clearly my arm is in a different position. Even when I'm holding a pose, such as a down dog, I'm still breathing in and out. And it is possible for me to have to engage emergency services if I don't, well, it translates into staying with the breath. So you'll see an example of this. Just keep an eye on the same trace.
Exhale. Deep breath in. Deep breath out. Inhale, right leg up and back, three-legged dog. Keep the
So in the end, I made a large motion and moved my leg. And clearly, so the other two senses are in my lower back. And I engaged active stabilization in my lower back. And it's very obvious which these two bottom traces. But the more important thing is the top trace, because when I'm in the same position, soon as at the end of my exhale, I start engaging active stabilization a little bit more. It's very small. It's an order of magnitude smaller than what you saw when people were reaching their arms out, but it's still there. Now, what happens under these conditions? I know I have a restriction in my body, and I try to overcome it by powering through it and doing a push-up.
Lower to your belly.
You see, it complains right there. So the more we force our way through, the worse these patterns have to become to support our bad habits.
Lower to your belly.
Just to compare my left and right forearms, my right forearm shakes about a third less than my left forearm, at least in this little bit. So active stabilization is useful to prevent tissue tears during emergencies, but we tend to overuse it due to restrictions that we caused either due to injuries or habits. Yoga, Tai Chi, breathing exercises can be used to become aware of this active stabilization and slowly overcome it through diligent practice. For example, my left arm was a lot worse before I started slowly getting it out rather than powering through it. So I did take, this is just an anecdote and personal opinion. I took a cardio course, and where they made me do a lot of push-ups. And my entire arm just shrank. My entire shoulder just shrank on the left side because the muscles had to get, uh, they had to support that joint through that load. So I hope this is a different way of thinking about how to overcome restrictions. I have a couple of demonstrations, but before I get into the second part, it'll take me a few minutes to set up the demonstrations to drive the same points home a little bit more. I would very much appreciate it if I could get your feedback on the course while I set up for these demonstrations. Was that enough time for the survey? Okay, excellent. So I'll do two demonstrations. First, let me explain what's on my arm. There's a green blinking thing. That's an accelerometer. It's measuring this shake that I'm talking about. And I have a bunch of stickers on my hand. I'm measuring the activity from my tricep muscle. Let me share the screen. So there's two graphs, both moving in time. The bottom graph shows the activity of my tricep muscle. So if I flex it, it's going to activate, right? And if I active stabilize, if you look at the top graph, you should see a lot more of the up-down wobbles. You see that? That's the shake. Now, I can have some wiring issues. So if I engage active stabilization on the top graph, you're going to see it as a wobble. But I didn't really tell you what to expect with respect to what my muscles do. I briefly hinted at it, but for now, just observe and make your deductions, and I'll talk about it after the demonstrations. So here's one way of reaching out. This is what I commonly see. So let's say I'm a little slouched and I try to reach out. So I see that wobble as I do this, right? So all I'm doing is moving my arm. It shouldn't be a big deal. But if it's a little worse, in many cases, what happens is my muscle kicks in. This is what happens in many cases. We also end up stressing the muscle. Alternative, how people say good posture, all of that stuff. It's a little more complicated than that, but I don't have to use my muscle, and I can engage very little active stabilization. Now I did a very small amount. Now I used a lot. And that was relatively nothing. That was close to nothing. If you have any questions about the demonstration, feel free to unmute yourself and talk to me. In the meantime, I'll set up for the second one.
Hey, Praneeth.
Hi.
Santosh here. Hey, just a question. What's the difference between the sensors on your forearms that aren't wireless versus the one on your
Sure.
bicep?
Right. So this is measuring acceleration. It has the potential to measure EMG, but the pickup range is different. So I'm using more traditional electrodes to pick up my activity from my muscles versus detecting the shaking. This is detecting the shaking. This is picking up activity from my muscles.
Got it. So that's more of an EMG and that's more of an IMU.
This is an EMG, this is an IMU. That's correct.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, second demonstration. Now, I'm measuring the activity of my forearm muscles. And if I flex them, see the bumps in the green graph, which is basically telling you how much I'm stressing my forearm muscles, right? So true, if I do it transiently, I'm contracting this muscle to move my wrist. That's fine. I'm just showing you where I'm recording from. Now, let's take a less obvious scenario. Let's say we all use a computer. We go to our keyboard, and the forearm is nice and happy. But let's see what happens to the forearm when we slouch. So we end up having to active stabilize the forearm whenever we slouch. Unfortunately, one of the instructions that we are given is sit straight, sit with the spine straight, right? So then we end up doing this. This gets worse. We end up actively, we were doing something which we are supposed to undo, but instead we end up doing even more, which puts more stress potentially on the arm. But the point is we should be able to turn it off. It's not fully straightforward, and I haven't given you concrete examples of how to achieve that yet. But maybe in a future course, we can go over some of those things. So let's look at one of the solutions that is available in the market, which is a vertical mouse. A vertical mouse is basically a mouse where you move it around by holding it like this instead of like this. So let's go back to our slouching position again. And then let me just twist my arm. And then the stress on my forearm is reduced, but nothing changed I'm still stressing a lot of other things in my body. So those were two examples of understanding and applying the concept of active stabilization and getting a better intuition of what that looks like when we can actually observe it. Let me share my screen again. Okay, so let's do a brief recap. I'm going to unplug myself. So in active stabilization, we saw the signature wobble, and the same muscles contribute to stabilization and movement. So let's think about what's happening in the case of reaching the arm out. So we are using, let's say, for example, we could be using the bicep and the tricep together to hold the shoulder in place instead of passively stabilizing it. And then we also need to make use of them to move the arm. So this is an example, again, of multitasking where we might inadvertently engage emergency services. And usually the movements, you can describe them as they look forced. In contrast, uh, when we mostly deal with passive stabilization and use muscles to move elastic energy around and stay consistent and true to the elastic energy cycle, muscle activity largely contributes to movement rather than holding things in place. And it feels like we are having fun. It's a very qualitative and non-concrete description, but that's usually the feeling, and or flowing. And the movements look effortless and flow, and movements that don't require emergency services are explored in the highest levels of movement discipline. This is personal opinion. That's what I believe. I haven't showed you any data. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the word coordination, and I'll also brought up the word multitasking. Let me show you an example of what I hate, an example of multitasking that I hate most. Uh, Running while watching something. It's almost as if when I'm running, I only need to use my legs, and I can use my head to do something else. True, you could do that, but then you are doing two different things. You're one organism, and you will end up in many cases blocking the flow of energy, either in your lower back or your neck somewhere, and then you're fighting to move while trying to keep things together. It's, in my opinion, is not a good way to go. So but multitasking can be many things, right? As we walk, we need to breathe. I'm not saying all multitasking is bad, but I'm saying there's different ways to multitask. The two tasks are something we are arbitrarily chopping up, right? So when I move my arm, I can say, oh, my elbow is doing something, my shoulder is doing something, my chest is doing something else. So maybe we are multitasking, or we can look at it as one movement. No matter how we chop them up, in general, the different things the different ways we chop up the movement, either they're interfering with each other, which happens commonly with active stabilization, or they don't interfere with each other, which is ideally the goal of active stabilization and multitasking, in the context of multitasking, or they reinforce each other. Like one task knows exactly the state of the other task, and there is an information channel open, and there is an transfer of energy that is beneficial in both directions. We already saw examples of this, and I just want to put it in this context. So we saw this phenomenon of double jumping. So in this case, the two tasks are jumping up and down and turning the rope. It's almost as if the arms are for turning the rope, and the rest of the body is for jumping. In contrast, in one turn per jump, I showed you an example of perhaps the arms are both for jumping and turning rope, and the legs are also both for jumping and turning rope. Double jump doesn't necessarily guarantee the suboptimal scenario of multitasking, but in this specific case, it did. And how do we know that? We measured the length of the arm muscles, and active stabilization usually involves a little bit of shortening. You hold things together. And the blue line shows when the up and down position of the big toe. So as soon as I touch down, we can either store that as elastic energy in different tissues. So we can store it just in the legs and torso, or spread it all the way throughout the arms. And then we can use that later. So in one case, as I was demonstrating, the muscles started in my arms started lengthening as I hit the ground. In this case, they started getting shorter, almost as if I don't want to be, I don't want interference from the jump. Right? So of course, I'm giving you interpretation, but uh, the data remains, right? So after the second jump, the second little jump is for building up um, elastic energy in the arms, and then you use it to jump. We also saw an example of this when I phased in and out in terms of being able to synchronize between my back muscles and my stomach moving in and out during a breathing exercise. So here, both are oscillating. My stomach is oscillating, my back muscles are oscillating. And suddenly I lose the oscillation in the back. It's like it's almost as if I'm holding my back and just to move my stomach around. That feels more stressful. So let's review briefly some of the mental models that we have gone through in this course. So how do rigid and elastic elements work together to create efficient movement? We used this little toy as an example of to understand how passive forces work, uh, right? So an external forces can be stored as elastic energy. Internal forces, let's say breathing, also can get stored as elastic energy. Imagine my arm, my fingers being the diaphragm in this case, and I'm working them, and then every other muscle gets stretched. What we don't want to avoid in the context of what we want to avoid in the context of active stabilization is this scenario where some strings go slack while other strings remain stretched. I don't know if it is visible, but in this case, these strings are slack. So you lose stability wherever in specific directions. What happens when we go faster? We end up storing more, keeping the total elastic energy in our body higher. And this is how we tune the frequency of bouncing up and down or whatever it is. The mental model I gave you was the idea of tuning a guitar. Imagine when you increase the tension in the guitar string, you produce a higher note. And if you increase the tension in the muscle system by changing length and not by increasing activation from the nervous system, you could go faster. So what is an effective use of elastic elements is to store activity as muscle activity as elastic energy. We saw it in the case of breathing. And they can be used for cooperative multitasking, like walking when breathing. So make sure both interact. How do we improve the flow of elastic energy? We can become aware of and reduce restrictions by shifting our multitasking towards cooperative multitasking. And one signature when this gets violated is whenever we see that wobble. So I'd like to also in this course help you make decisions based on the information that was given through these 4 sessions. So your task right now is to interpret somebody asked me about this workout and they're like, what do you think about it? So given everything I've told you, what do you think about it? So let me tell you a little bit about this workout. It's inspired by or somehow related to Tom Brady, who is still able to perform at the highest levels at the age of 43. Now, It involves a lot of elastic elements, but one of their opinion is that you cannot train slow and move fast. For optimal performance, you have to train at the speed of your sport. In this course, I have told you the relationship between fast and slow movements. I've showed examples of both. And so how do you interpret that statement that slow movements cannot aid fast movements? Are slow, deliberate movements useful to improve fast movements? Okay, all right. Most of us say yes. But if you said yes, now you know what I'm going to ask you. How do slow movement exploration aid fast movements? Have a couple of answers. Improve baseline efficiency, helps you explore limits. I agree with these. Helps to learn the movement. Yes, instead of imposing patterns that we already are used to, that come from habits. Identify restrictions and areas of overuse. Yes, so uh, counterintuitively, I think, if you try to walk really, really slow, it is almost impossible to do exactly what you do when you walk at your normal walking pace. We end up changing the template. So it can be very useful to try to recapture the things that we do intuitively at different speeds. Train your muscles not to use active stabilization as much and resulting in less impedance when speeding up your movement. Yes. Build joint stability and muscle strength with less stress on the body. Yes. Uh, Train fine details of accurate movements. I agree with all of these things, but the way I would word it or how I think about it for myself is it's basically to identify restrictions and undo restrictions slowly. So that's the most important use, and to explore limits, like it's already been said, right? So slow, deliberate movements can be used to identify and remove restrictions to facilitate fast movements. This is a question that we all ask ourselves if we decide to exercise and for whatever goals we have, we're like, which one should I do? There's many out there, many thing workouts which say many different things. But I hope what you can take away from this course is no matter which one you choose, there will be an optimal and a suboptimal way of doing things. Perhaps some workouts are tuned to better deal with common habits that we are used to. But any movement, as long as we stick to these principles and be deliberate about them and not and where we don't have to engage emergency services, in my book, is good. So before we end, I want to say that I want to reiterate that there are many opportunities in the immersion lab. We could create content together if this course provided you with ideas of what some things you want to explore. For example, once campus reopens and the situation settles down, we are hoping to have courses and workshops where we bring people in and they can try these demonstrations on themselves. And we are planning many of these things in the upcoming months. So if you would like to be informed about these opportunities and interests, please write your email, but there is absolutely no pressure. And you always have my email. You can always reach out. Okay, thank you very much. My hope is that this course has equipped you with some actionable information that can assist you in making educated decisions for your wellness and your workouts. And thank you for listening, and thank you for participating and sticking with me till the end. And I will stay back for questions. And I apologize for going over. Oh, it's right on time. Okay. Would I repeat my definition of emergency services? So this is thank you for asking. I think let's talk about active and passive stabilization. Active stabilization, I think of as emergency services. Active stabilization is trying to stabilize a joint using input from the central nervous system continuously and passive stabilization is where you require less of that. Could it be weakness? This is probably a response to a question I asked earlier. I don't remember the context. I apologize. But yes, active stabilization could be due to a prior injury. I know we think about things in terms of weakness and strength. For example, when I tore a meniscus in my knee, I couldn't run for several years. The message I kept getting was make your knee stronger, make the muscle stronger. I just kept making it worse and worse. Until I learned to understand these concepts, I couldn't run more than a mile. That's just a personal anecdote. It doesn't, I prefer to think in terms of stabilization and mobility as opposed to strength, because strength, I think, is a byproduct of the things we would like to do. And we just want to make sure we get our whole selves to do something. So please unmute yourself and ask this question again. Why does the right forearm also decrease in acceleration?
It was when you were showing the graph, both your forearms, I think when you were doing the push-up, I'm guessing.
Right.
I can't quite recall, but it looked like your left forearm.
A fast component and a slow component, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, it was, the amplitude was definitely higher on the left forearm, or the frequency was also higher, but it was going up while your right was going down.
So part of what an IMU is measuring is the gravity field, right? So if I keep my arm this way versus this way, the acceleration due to gravity, the effect of the gravity is going to change. So those were the slow trends that you're watching, and they were approximately at the speed of me moving. The faster ones is what I'm trying to eliminate.
True, but why was your left going up while your right was going down?
Oh, because they're pointing different directions.
Got it. Okay. So it's just,
it was that axis.
Okay. So we just care about the absolute value, not necessarily the sign.
That's right.
Okay. Got it.
I mean, the absolute value, the frequency is useful for this, but what you saw is useful for other things.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
How does weakness show up? How do I know that my left side is contraction stabilizing and wobbling and not wobbling because it is weak in comparison to the right arm? Good. That's an excellent question. And I didn't show you data to compare how strong my arms are relative to each other. But we could do that. The idea is I'm engaging it in very similar positions, even when it's not a question of strength, because I'm not really, I'm nowhere near the limit of my strength when I'm just reaching out in front of me or just making my arm this way. When I'm doing a push-up, this is a legitimate question, and I haven't showed you anything to address it, I admit. But when you're doing everyday movements like walking or anything, we should try not to stabilize. We should try not to engage active stabilization. Is Peloton multitasking? As I said, if it's cooperative multitasking, it's fine. You can do your Peloton workouts. But anything where you have to, like, this is for something, this is for something else, without having to get to the cooperative multitasking realm, I wouldn't do it myself. That's all. Yes, so regarding workouts, I said that less active stabilization is better, but does shaking help us explore our limits? Yes. So let's take in last session, somebody asked about a bar class. So let's take the example of a bar class. If you don't know what it is, it's a workout motivated by ballet, and you hold yourself in specific positions, and then you start moving your leg in you start doing a small motion. So for example, you would go something like this, and then start moving your leg up and down. And by the end, I don't know if you can see my leg. By the end of it, many times it is said that if you start shaking, then you have used that muscle. So what you're doing there is, yes, you're exploring the limits of that muscle, but the shaking comes after you have used. You're exploring the limits of how much you can use that muscle. Even when you're not active stabilizing, you can still use muscles, and they will get your burning calories. You're still making use of it, but most of it to create movement. So the short answer is yes, shaking helps us explore our limits, but if our goal is to get to shake, I would disagree. So curious if you work with medical teams to help patients identify issues in their movement patterns and use data to tailor treatment. I have not done this yet. So, and if you're interested in doing that, please email me. Does the captioner produce a transcript, and can it be shared? Yes, the transcript can be shared. And once I receive it from the captioner, I will share it with you. But okay, let's see if there's any other questions that got upvoted. Oh, there's some upvote. Does more shaking when you are weightlifting result in increased muscle building? I do not know the answer to this. But what I do know is there is an expression in weightlifting is don't lift with your ego. I believe what it's referring to is make sure you know what your limits are, and make sure when you're doing a deadlift, for example, make sure you don't active stabilize your back before you do the deadlift, and make sure you're sinking the elastic energy. You're using those strings to help you lift, as opposed to just using one or two muscles. So form is very important even in weightlifting, as far as I know. But when you try, as beginners, when we try to lift weights, it's much easier to fall out of the correct form. Would you recommend wobbling or shaking during weightlifting, I assume, to stress during weight building to stress or build more muscles, but work on eliminating this in other activities? Uh, Again, this is purely my personal opinion. If I have to say it, I would say no. It's always about whichever dimension you're exploring your limits, find your limits in the context of the whole and push them a little bit. Because as soon as I start shaking, I feel uncomfortable. I don't like being uncomfortable. We have a question in the chat. Are the signals consistent every time? Are the same for arm leg movement pattern? If you're talking about the IMU, and it's approximately at the same frequency, and people have discovered this before, but they don't think about it this way. So just to put it that way, just to put it out there. And what they have also discovered with meticulous research is that they observe this shaking when the muscle length goes below 90% of optimal force exertion length. So you're not operating at the optimal for that muscle, but the question remains, is it possible to always operate at optimal? And I think that's a more interesting question, and many different fields of movement, like dancing, sports, they all explore this, in my opinion. Can I go over again the relationship between breathing and active stabilization? So ideally, there is no active stabilization during breathing. However, it is possible to do so, especially we end up tending to tense our lower back muscles and to create bigger oscillations in breathing. So that's an example of when we use active stabilization in breathing. If I didn't answer your question, please unmute yourself and ask me or talk to me. See if there's any other questions that got upvoted. Okay, if not, I will still stay back if you think of any other questions, but I'll officially end the session. So thank you so much for participating. And if you feel like unmuting yourself and talking to me, please do so.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm learning fencing, which is mostly about agility and speed changes. Is there a better way to store elastic energy in your muscles to attack without showing it to your opponent?
Good question. I think the person that was really good at that was Bruce Lee. As you saw, the many signatures of active stabilization today, they are not really visible. What you can, the short answer is yes, but if you're asking me how to do it, that's a much longer conversation. Did I sort of answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this course.
You're welcome. And if you would like to have that longer conversation, just email me.
Okay, thank you.
What are the practical applications of the exercise? Can we talk about which exercise you're referring to? The question in the chat. Oh, what are the practical applications of what we're doing? So for example, you could think about creating a feedback system where people become more aware of where and when active stabilization is being engaged. If you're training, for example, in dancing, your instructor might tell you, please figure out where and when things went like you didn't imagine. So let's say you're losing balance. So it's usually a few hundred milliseconds before you become aware of the imbalance. And we can detect that and help people train. So I mostly think about it in the context of training and improvement, but it can also be used, as somebody suggested, for rehabilitation and recovery. Personally, I've used it for recovering from an accident. But again, the measurements, you don't have to do it through measurement. You have the information because you have sensors built into yourself, right? Through your skin, through your muscles. Only the problem is we never get trained on learning and exploiting the signals and how to read them. It is like looking at an X-ray. A trained person can look at it and be extremely specific about what's happening. But if we are untrained, we don't know what we're looking for. And so measurements can be helpful if we don't want to train our how to look for these things by going inside and paying attention inward.
Oh, can I add a quick comment? I was the person talking about the medical treatment aspect of it.
Yeah.
So some of us actually have like broken sensors as well. Like there's some connective tissue diseases, which is what I have, where there's a thought that your internal perception of your joints and joint positions and all of those is also impaired for some like currently unknown reasons. And so I think like this kind of thing would be really helpful. And a lot of the physical therapy, they try to get you to practice the active stabilization to develop like your ability to like do passive stabilization, I guess. But it's extremely difficult to be like, I don't know if what I'm doing is correct, if the muscles are actually activating, because my own like sensing of what's going on may be impaired also. So I think like for stuff like that, it could be actually be like super helpful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that comment. I really appreciate that. And I think your suggestion about bringing it to the clinic and testing it under many different scenarios becomes important before it can be translated and widely applicable. So thank you for sharing that.